Ancho. The wind moves without sound across an endless white, brushing against the broken tusk of something that once lived. Something enormous. Something that breathed the same air we do. Beneath that snow lies a silence so deep it feels older than language. A silence that remembers footsteps too heavy for time to carry. Some say extinction is a word for endings, but perhaps it's only another form of memory. We are told the Ice Age ended 12,000 years ago, but when you listen closely, it still exhales through the cracks of frozen soil, whispering of creatures too vast, too enduring, to truly vanish. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And tell me, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it there? Because somewhere, while you lie in warmth, the earth is still holding its breath for the giants it once carried. When the first explorers began to find bones in the Siberian permafrost, they thought they belonged to buried monsters, drowned in some primeval flood. They found skulls larger than any elephants, tusks curving like moons. Some were so perfectly preserved that the flesh still smelled of age and iron. To touch it was to touch the last pulse of a vanished world. But that world was not fiction. It was real. Vast herds of mammoths, mastodons, and shaggy bison walking through storms that could strip skin from bone, moving across continents as if drawn by an invisible map only they could read. In the deep cold, life found strange ways to endure. Size became warmth, fat became memory, hair became armor. Even blood changed its chemistry to flow where it should have frozen. For hundreds of thousands of years, the ice itself was alive with motion. But something happened. A change. Too quick. Too quiet. Too final. The snow covered their trails before they could make new ones. It buried their voices before their stories could end. Scientists often speak of extinction as data. Carbon dates, isotope ratios, genome fragments. But in that frozen ground, what they truly study is silence. Every tusk unearthed, every tooth catalogued, is a fragment of a sentence we can no longer finish. Some say a warming world melted their pastures away. Others believe we hunted them faster than they could remember how to hide. Yet, the truth feels heavier. As if both reasons are only shadows cast by something deeper. A shift in the rhythm of the earth itself. Imagine an Arctic night 40,000 years ago. The air glows with green aurora. A herd of mammoths moves slowly across the snow. Each step presses heat into the ground. Each trunk brushes frost from another's back. Somewhere far away, a human watches their silhouettes through the dark, tracing their path in the mind like a secret he cannot name. That moment, that gaze between species, may have already contained the beginning of an ending. What if the disappearance of the giants was not an accident, but a kind of exchange? As they faded, we began to multiply. As their voices dimmed, ours grew louder. Every fire we built was lit with their memory. Bone shelters, tusk tools, fur cloaks. It is possible that humanity's first warmth was borrowed from their final breath. The fossils tell us they did not all die at once. Across continents, their traces vanish like the last notes of a song stretched too thin. In one layer of soil, footprints. In the next, emptiness. On Wrangel Island, mammoths survived thousands of years longer than their kin. Isolated, shrinking in size, their genomes fraying from inbreeding. Imagine them there, alone on a tundra island surrounded by sea ice, unaware that the rest of their kind had disappeared. Their footsteps would have sounded like echoes from another time. And still, questions linger. Why do some carcasses appear frozen mid-motion? food still in their mouths, eyes wide as if startled by something sudden. What force could stop a heartbeat in an instant and seal it beneath miles of ice for millennia? The climate, perhaps. Or a pulse from the sky. Or a tremor from deep within the earth. No one knows. The Ice Age keeps its secrets. We are left to listen. To the wind threading through empty valleys. To the silence between bones. To the faint resonance of a world that was never meant to vanish so quietly. The giants ruled through patience, not conquest. They moved with the Earth's slow heartbeat, not against it. And perhaps that is why they could not survive a species that moved faster, thought sharper, desired more. But even now, traces remain. In Siberian ice cores, strands of their DNA drift like ghosts. In certain northern lakes, sediments still bear the pollen of the plants they grazed upon. The shape of tundra forests still follows their ancient paths. Their extinction was not erasure, only transformation. The Earth never forgets. It just learns to speak differently. Maybe that's what this frozen silence really is. The pause between two breaths of history, one that ended, and one that's still waiting to begin again. And so, when you close your eyes tonight, imagine them walking again beneath the aurora, enormous and gentle, their shadows folding into the snow. The air trembles with their quiet rhythm. For a moment, the distance between past and present thins. The world feels whole again. Before it learned how to forget. The world was once a furnace of ice. Oceans pulled back into frozen vaults. Mountains of white glass crawling across the continents. Yet from this cold, something miraculous happened. Life did not retreat. It expanded. The air was sharp enough to cut breath. But the creatures that endured became magnificent in scale. They were not errors of nature, but responses to it. In the hush of a frozen dawn, the Earth was learning to balance fragility with mass. Gigantism, the scientists call it. A simple word for an impossible choice. To live in the age of ice was to grow larger, not smaller. A small body loses heat too fast. A large one carries its warmth like a slow-burning star. Over generations, nature sculpted armor from flesh and bone. Each creature a quiet calculation of survival. But the question that hums beneath the data is quieter, more human. Why did everything need to become enormous just to stay alive? Perhaps it was not only the cold. Perhaps the planet itself demanded spectacle. Something immense enough to carry its loneliness. Across the northern plains, mammoths walked like moving hills. Their breath steamed into the sky like offerings. Giant deer carried antlers wider than doorways. The ground trembled beneath the weight of ancient bison, musk oxen, and woolly rhinoceros. In the far south, marsupial lions prowled the eucalyptus shadows, while ground sloths dragged forests apart with unhurried grace. It was a planet of titans, bound together by the cold. Each pulse of blood a resistance to oblivion. We like to imagine them lumbering, slow, ancient. But the bones tell another story, of muscle, movement, and heat. Mammoth femurs thicker than oak trunks, their marrow dense with the memory of migration. Isotopes preserved in tusks show seasonal shifts. Rivers crossed, grasslands revisited. The pattern of endurance repeated again and again until something broke it. It's strange to think of size as a form of intelligence, but in the Ice Age, to be vast was to be wise, to understand the mathematics of scarcity and cold. And yet, for all their mastery, the giants were never rulers in the human sense. They were servants of balance, Their weight sculpted valleys, their hunger maintained grasslands, their dung fed soil and seed. Each of them was a system, an ecosystem wearing a heartbeat. Remove one and the rest trembled. It's easy now, staring at their fossils under museum lights, to think we've understood them. But what if their immensity was not just biological? What if it was spiritual? The earth expressing itself through bodies too large to forget. The fossils whisper clues in patterns we barely hear. In Alaska, the remains of giant steppe bison show rapid bone growth during colder intervals, as if life itself leaned toward the frost, not away from it. In Eurasia, a correlation appears. As temperatures fell, species became larger. Heat was the enemy. The cold was home. The very thing that seems hostile to us was their cradle. To them, the Ice Age was not a disaster. It was perfection. But the perfection of one age is always the weakness of the next. When the glaciers began to melt, their world lost its architecture. Rivers grew violent, plains drowned, vegetation shifted north faster than herds could follow. Bodies built for endurance suddenly became burdens. And there, in that moment between adaptation and extinction, something irreversible began. Scientists model this transition as climate data. Ice cores, oxygen isotopes, pollen charts. But beneath those numbers is an emotion the Earth doesn't measure. Exhaustion. The giants carried more than mass. They carried time, and time had finally grown too heavy. Somewhere in that slow collapse, our kind appeared in greater numbers. Small, clever, warm-handed. We did not move like them. We moved faster, with fire, with tools, with hunger sharpened into strategy. Where they needed seasons, we needed only moments. Where they carried the weight of balance, we carried the lightness of desire. And slowly, invisibly, the scales shifted. But even as our ancestors watched the herds fade, they must have known they were witnessing something sacred. Imagine them standing on a ridge, watching mammoths file across a valley of mist. The air cold enough to burn the lungs, the light bruised and blue. They would have felt it. That ancient balance trembling. The first sense of an ending no one could name. Some might have prayed to them. Some might have followed them into the snow, as if chasing the last truth the world still remembered. Because the Ice Age was not just an age of cold. It was an age of meaning. Every breath, every movement was deliberate. The slow heartbeat of the earth echoed in each creature that walked upon it. When we speak of those giants now, we forget that they once lived in synchrony. No waste, no rush, no greed. They were not monsters but monuments, living archives of patience. And in their extinction, something in us may have been erased too. Perhaps that's why their bones draw us still. Not as curiosities, but as mirrors. We look at them and recognize a version of ourselves that once understood rhythm instead of conquest. A self that did not need to rush to survive. If the Ice Age giants taught the Earth anything, it was that size cannot protect against time. The same vastness that sustained them also doomed them. For nothing immense can move fast enough to escape change. They were victories of physics, but casualties of evolution. Their greatness was the price they paid for harmony, and maybe that's the deeper mystery. The Earth created beings large enough to hold its cold heart, and then took them back, quietly, without warning, as if the experiment had run its course. When the thaw came, it did not roar. It whispered. Ice melted into rivers, rivers into oceans, oceans into clouds, and the giants, Those slow miracles of heat and endurance sank beneath the weight of time, their bones folding gently into the soil they had shaped. Tonight, as the wind brushes your window, remember, the cold they carried is still here, written in the chemistry of your blood, in the curve of your lungs, in the ancient agreement between breath and air. We are smaller now, but we carry their echo. Each heartbeat is a faint continuation of that long, slow rhythm. The rhythm that began when the world decided to grow large enough to survive its own silence. There are places in Siberia where the ground itself still sighs. The permafrost softens in summer, releasing the scent of something older than civilization. A smell of iron, musk, and damp fur. Beneath it lie the bodies of mammoths, sealed as if time were afraid to disturb them. Their hair still clings to their skulls. Their skin still folds over the ribs that once moved with breath. Some were found with flowers in their mouths, as if they had been grazing when the world stopped breathing. To speak of mammoths is to speak of memory. Not ours, but the Earth's. They were creatures of migration, of recollection. They remembered waterholes buried under ice, routes hidden beneath snow, and the taste of grasses that no longer exist. A mammoth herd moved as one mind stretched across generations. When an elder died, the others lingered, touching her bones with their trunks before moving on. Scientists call this mourning behavior. But what if it was more? What if memory itself was their survival strategy? A way to navigate both distance and grief. There is a story in their tusks. Each year, a new layer grew, recording the chemistry of what they ate and where they roamed. A spiral diary of motion. When scientists sliced through one and read its isotopes, they discovered a pattern of travel so vast that no modern animal comes close. Thousands of miles, returning to the same plains again and again as if answering an invisible summons. Yet in the final rings, something changes. The pattern falters. The chemical signature of drought, hunger, and stress replaces the rhythm of migration. It's as if the earth whispered a warning, and the mammoths, in all their wisdom, could not decipher it in time. When we look at their remains now, in laboratories chilled to echo their lost climate, it's hard to imagine the living creature, the warmth of its breath, the vibration in the air when it called. Scientists have reconstructed the frequency of their vocalizations from skull cavities and resonance chambers. Low, subsonic, a sound that could travel miles through fog and snow. If you stood in an Ice Age valley at dawn, you wouldn't have seen the herd first. You would have felt it in your bones, before your ears could name it. Somewhere in that sound was a language of belonging. They spoke not to command, but to remember. Mothers and daughters, calves and elders, voices echoing across centuries of cold. Their societies were matriarchal, built on shared memory. Wisdom passed through sound and scent. When the matriarch died, the herd did not just lose a leader. It lost a library. Perhaps that is what extinction really is. The burning of a memory we never got to read. The mammoth's body was a masterpiece of adaptation. Its fur contained two types of hair, long guard hairs to trap heat, and fine underwool to seal it in. Its ears were small to reduce heat loss. Even the shape of its hemoglobin was altered, allowing blood to flow at temperatures that would freeze most mammals solid. Every cell was tuned to the Ice Age like an instrument to its song. But perfection is fragile. The same precision that kept them alive could not adjust when the tempo of the planet changed. There is a strange tenderness in how we find them. Frozen mid-step, heads bowed as if listening to something beneath the ice. They do not look defeated. They look paused, waiting. Their bodies preserved so completely that they seem almost ready to stand again. shake the frost from their fur, and continue north. And perhaps that illusion is why they haunt us more than dinosaurs or ancient reptiles. Those died in cataclysm, erased by fire. The mammoths simply fell asleep and never woke up. We keep trying to wake them. Scientists in Japan have extracted nuclei from their cells, coaxed fragments of DNA to flicker in the eggs of modern elephants. They call it de-extinction, but the term feels naive, as if you could reassemble the soul of a vanished world from genetic code alone. A living mammoth is not just a sequence of base pairs. It is the sound of wind through grass that no longer grows, the crunch of snow on ground that no longer exists, the rhythm of migration across landscapes erased by time. What would such a creature do in our world if it returned? Where would it walk? What would it remember? There's an unease in that question, one scientists rarely voice. Because to bring them back is not just to revive an animal. It is to resurrect the memory of a time when we were small and they were gods. When survival required humility, not dominion. When the earth still spoke in the deep tones of frozen rivers and skyfire. Sometimes, when you see the curve of a mammoth tusk under museum light, you can almost feel the air of that lost epoch. A cold that wasn't cruel, only complete. A silence that wasn't empty, only full of things too vast to name. The mammoths walked in that silence like moving prayers, each step a repetition of faith. That the world would remain as it was, that the snow would always return, that memory itself could outlast hunger. But memory can be both a gift and a curse. Their minds, so attuned to routes and patterns, may have led them back to death. Herds, following ancient paths toward lands that no longer bloomed, drinking from rivers that no longer flowed. The wisdom of the past, once sacred, became the trap of the present. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden in their bones, that even the best memory can betray you when the world has already moved on. That survival is not about holding on, but about letting go in time. Now, when the Arctic summer melts another inch of permafrost and another mammoth surfaces from sleep, we are reminded how brief the separation is between then and now. The smell of that thawed fur is the scent of time collapsing. The eyes that never closed properly stare through millennia, as if trying to recognize us. The fragile inheritors of their silence. Tonight, if you listen carefully, you might still hear them. In the hum of your refrigerator, in the wind pressing against your window pane, the low, patient resonance of something that refuses to be forgotten. They are still walking, somewhere just beyond the curtain of sound, following the memory of a world that once knew how to endure the cold. But if the mammoths were the architects of the plains, then the mastodons were the gardeners of the forests. Quieter, heavier, slower, but no less grand. Where the mammoths roamed open tundra, the mastodons moved through dark groves of spruce and pine, through bogs heavy with mist, where the air smelled of wet bark and moss. Their world was softer, dimmer, filled with the hush of dripping leaves and snapping branches. Every tree that fell beneath their tusks, every sapling they stripped, shaped the forest that would follow. Their bodies were built for shadow. Shorter legs, stockier frames, tusks that curved upward like crescents. Not for sweeping snow, but for tearing bark. Fossils of their teeth revealed deep ridges, made for crushing twigs and branches rather than grass. They ate the forest itself, and the forest, strangely, thrived. By toppling trees, they opened light to the undergrowth. By stripping bark, they made space for new shoots. Even their footprints created small wetlands where amphibians and insects would later bloom. They were destruction as renewal, chaos as balance. When scientists excavated their remains in the Great Lakes region, they found more than bones. Inside some of the carcasses were remnants of spruce needles, maple leaves, even half-chewed twigs. Tiny moments of life perfectly preserved. A mastodon's last meal, still frozen in its stomach. It's easy to romanticize these fragments, but they are evidence of something intimate. A creature that knew its forest so well it could taste its seasons. Their isotopes show migration in rhythm with the melting snow, from swamp to woodland and back again. In that rhythm, there was no waste, no hurry, but something about the mastodons feels even more haunted than the mammoths. Perhaps because they lived closer to us, not just in time, but in temperament. They were creatures of routine, returning year after year to the same waterholes, the same feeding grounds. When the climate began to warm, the forests they depended on changed faster than they could adapt. The trees that once fed them retreated north, replaced by grasses they could not digest. The mastodons did not follow. They waited. And in that patience lay their end. We find their bones in clusters, as if families died together. Mothers and calves, buried side by side. Some paleontologists think they fell through melting bogs, trapped in the same pools they once drank from. Others suggest sudden floods or human hunts. At several excavation sites, stones shaped by human hands were found near the bones, as if someone once carved them to strike. A spearhead embedded in a rib, a tool left in the mud. And so, the silence of extinction deepens. No longer just climate, but contact. There is a site in Indiana where a mastodon skeleton still bears the scars of fire. The bones are charred black at their ends, the ivory tusks split by heat. Around them, scientists found fragments of stone tools, flakes of flint, and what might have been a hearth. They call it the kill site. But the word feels wrong. It suggests cruelty, but this was survival. One species standing at the edge of hunger, facing another that had fed generations of forests. Perhaps those first humans felt awe, as much as need. Imagine it. The sound of a dying giant echoing through the trees, the crackle of flame against tusk, the awareness that something ancient had ended and something new had begun. The mastodon's extinction rippled through everything. Forest grew denser, less fertile. Seeds that depended on their digestion to germinate began to vanish. Wetlands shifted. Insect populations changed. Birds lost nesting grounds. What we call extinction is never singular. It is a chain of quiet collapses that continues long after the last heart stops beating. In their absence, the forest forgot how to breathe. Modern ecologists studying pollen cores from ancient swamps found sudden transitions. Plant communities that seemed to lose coherence after the mastodons disappeared. Trees grew unchecked, choking one another. The ground hardened. The balance broke. The forest that remains today is only a pale shadow of the one they once shaped. A painting missing its brushstrokes. And yet, the mastodons live on in the most unlikely of places. The genetic dust floating inside us. Mitochondrial comparisons between mastodons and modern elephants reveal long separations, yet shared origins. When you look into the slow eyes of an elephant today, you are staring into a memory millions of years deep. Elephants still strip bark. They still dig with tusks. They still mourn their dead. Somewhere in their cells, a faint echo of the mastodon hums on. Like a melody half forgotten but never lost. There is something profoundly human in their story. Not in their extinction, but in their endurance. They adapted through countless shifts in ice and forest, through epochs that erased entire species, until the final warmth came too suddenly. Their failure to survive was not weakness. It was loyalty. They trusted the rhythm of the world too long. The same patience that kept them alive for millennia betrayed them in the end. And perhaps that's what we recognize in them. The tragedy of creatures who believe the world would remain familiar. We too live by patterns, assuming the sun will rise the same way. The seasons will return. The future will echo the past. But the earth changes faster than faith can follow. One day, even our routines might become fossils of persistence. When you think of the mastodon, don't imagine violence or extinction. Imagine devotion. A creature returning to the same grove, year after year, trusting that the trees would be waiting. Imagine the quiet strength of a herd moving through snow-laden forest. The sound of tusks brushing branches. The faint rumble of low calls passing between them like reassurance. They were the guardians of stillness, the stewards of rhythm, and though their bones now rest under layers of mud and moss, their work remains written in the architecture of the land, in the curves of riverbanks, the spacing of trees, the soil that still holds traces of their tread. The forest, in its own way, still remembers their footsteps. It sighs in wind, creaks in trunk, and rustles in leaves that would not exist without them. Perhaps one day, long after we're gone, the earth will speak of us the same way, not in words, but in echoes. The spaces we left behind, the rhythms we broke, the silences that followed. The mastodons vanished because they trusted the forest. We may vanish because we did not. Long before the forest fell silent, before the last mastodon sank into its own reflection in a thawing pool, the predators had already begun to vanish. They ruled not with numbers, but with timing, with stillness, with patience, with the perfect art of waiting. And among them, none were more feared or more beautiful than the saber-tooths. To imagine them is to imagine precision wrapped in muscle and silence. They did not run. They emerged. Their canines, longer than a man's hand, curved not for tearing but for incision. Blades of bone honed by evolution to end life swiftly, without waste. The saber-tooth, Smilodon fatalis, was not built for pursuit like modern lions. Its body was dense, compact, powerful. The jaws could not crush bones, but could pierce flesh with surgical certainty. It was a killer shaped by geometry, not chaos. In the tar pits of La Brea, thousands of their bones lie tangled together, victims of their own hunger, trapped while feeding on others already caught. The fossils are not mere remains. They are a frozen theater of desperation. Scientists have found evidence of healed injuries, broken ribs, fractured limbs, proof that these beasts cared for one another, that they lived in groups. In the warmth of extinction's shadow, even the predators showed tenderness. But tenderness could not save them. Their world depended on abundance, on herds that darkened the horizon, on prey whose flesh was plentiful and whose migrations predictable. When those herds faltered, the saber-tooth starved not because they were weak, but because they were too specialized. Their fangs, their pride, their very perfection became their undoing. The same evolutionary brilliance that made them kings left them no way to change. Sometimes I wonder if the last saber-tooth hunted alone. The wind tearing through a valley stripped of bison, the echo of his roar returning unanswered. He would have walked the frozen ground, following scents that led nowhere, shapes that disappeared into fog. His fangs, once symbols of dominion, became burdens, heavy ivory reminders of what the world no longer offered. There's a strange grief in imagining that, a creature built for the instant of death, forced to live through a long, slow, dying. They were not the only ones. The short-faced bear, Arctodus simus, once stood taller than a man on all fours, its legs built for speed, its jaws for bone. It could sprint faster than any human alive. But even this monstrous grace was not enough. Its long limbs, made for running down prey across open plains, became liabilities when the forest closed in. The bear, the saber-tooth, the dire wolf, each carried an empire in its body, and the earth, by changing shape, took that empire away. There is a fragment of truth buried in their teeth. Microscopic scratches on enamel reveal diet, struggle, and adaptation. Some saber-tooths shifted to scavenging, others hunted smaller animals, but the effort was futile. Large predators need large prey. The equation cannot be rewritten. As the Ice Age thawed, the balance collapsed. The chain that began with sunlight and grass ended with hunger. And yet, something of them survives. Not in form, but in the fear they left behind. Even in our myths, the image of the fanged cat lingers. Ancient cave paintings show them not as monsters, but as rivals. In the darkness, early humans drew them with reverence, the way one might depict a god. Their shape, their eyes, their symmetry. It's as if those who painted them knew that memory itself was a form of survival. Predators are never truly gone. Their shadows remain in everything that remembers being hunted. Modern lions still move with echoes of their ancient kin. The twitch before a pounce, the whisper of breath before a strike. All borrowed gestures, inherited instincts from those who came before. The fear that once rippled through the herds remains in the DNA of their descendants. Evolution, after all, is not only adaptation. It is memory made flesh. What makes the extinction of predators so tragic is that it unravels the story from both ends. Prey depend on danger. Fear keeps ecosystems alive. When the hunters vanish, balance falters. Too many herbivores, too little regrowth, soil stripped, forests fading. The world becomes quieter, but also emptier. Life needs its teeth to remember restraint. Perhaps that is why their disappearance feels heavier than others. The mammoths left grandeur. The mastodons left structure. But the saber-tooths took silence with them. The kind of silence that only follows a roar. In that absence, the Earth's heartbeat changed tempo. We think of predators as cruel, but cruelty is a human word. To them, killing was not sin but song. A perfect note in the cycle of life, quick, necessary, precise. Without them, the music loses its dissonance, and something in the melody collapses. Imagine, then, the last night of the saber-tooth. The moon low and red above the tundra. The air thick with thaw. He moves through a world that no longer recognizes him. The deer are gone, the bison herds dispersed. The air smells different, thinner, too warm. He lowers his head, sensing something vast and invisible shifting beneath the stars. The knowledge that the song has ended, and he is the echo left behind. He does not rage. He lies down, heavy with hunger, beneath the skeleton of a fallen tree. His breath slows, his eyes close, and somewhere inside that fading pulse, the entire Ice Age seems to exhale with him. We will find his bones one day. We will clean them, name them, measure them. We will speak of muscle and evolution, of prey and predation. But what we will not measure is the absence, the emptiness of a world that no longer trembles beneath the weight of hunters. In that stillness, the forest grew too thick. The deer multiplied, the grass vanished, the soil eroded. The earth itself seemed to forget the pulse of pursuit. Even now, when you walk alone through a forest at night, that faint unease that brushes your spine, That is not fear of what is there. It is memory of what is missing. The predators remind us that beauty and danger were once the same thing, that every heartbeat of life depended on something that could end it. And in losing them, we lost a mirror, a reflection of nature's necessary sharpness, the honesty of hunger. They lived for moments. We live for meaning. They killed to survive. We kill to understand. Yet in the dark of night, when all words fall silent, the difference between us narrows to a breath. Somewhere deep in the evolutionary marrow of our bones, a fragment of their hunger remains. Not for flesh, but for belonging. And perhaps that is what the saber-tooths were chasing all along. Not prey, but balance. The invisible thread that held the world taut between birth and death. When that thread snapped, they followed it into silence. And the world, softer but lonelier, kept turning without them. And long after the fangs had dulled and the great predators were gone, another kind of giant moved through the ancient landscape. Slow, deliberate, enormous as a continent's breadth. They were the ground sloths, creatures of impossible patience, shaped not for speed or violence, but for quiet persistence. When they walked, the earth seemed to wait. In the dense forests of South America, where the air shimmered with mist and the canopy broke into slow-moving light, Megatherium, the great ground sloth, stood like a walking fortress. It could reach 6 meters high, strong enough to push over trees, heavy enough to leave craters in the soil that filled with rainwater and became ponds. Its claws were scythes, not for killing, but for reshaping. It tore down branches to eat leaves, carved clearings into dense woods, opened spaces where sunlight could reach the forest floor. In the silence of those green cathedrals, it was both gardener and ghost. Their movement was measured, almost ceremonial. A single step could take seconds. They did not hurry, because nothing around them demanded haste. Even predators rarely attacked them, not because the sloth was invincible, but because its size made violence inefficient. A single slash from its forelimb could disembowel a lion. But it almost never used that strength. Power without aggression. That was the signature of these forgotten giants. There is something otherworldly about the fossils of ground sloths. In caves along the Andes, explorers have found dung so perfectly preserved that it still smells faintly of hay and dust. Inside those ancient pellets, scientists found seeds of trees that no longer exist. Seeds that once passed through the gut of giants, scattered across the land as they wandered. Many of those plants have never returned. Their fruits evolved to be eaten by creatures large enough to swallow them whole. Without their dispersers, they simply stopped reproducing. In every tropical forest today, there are ghosts of those trees. Species alive but stranded, waiting for the return of a partner that will never come. It is strange to think that forests, those symbols of endurance, could be incomplete. Yet without their slow engineers, even jungles forget how to breathe. Ecologists call this the anachronism of evolution, when plants and ecosystems outlive the animals they depended on. It's a kind of ecological grief, silent but enduring. And still, the ground sloths adapted longer than most. They crossed from South to North America, walking through what is now Panama, into open plains and forests that had never seen such creatures before. Fossils found in Nevada and Texas show herds grazing in small valleys where desert now lies. Imagine that. An army of colossal sloths moving through sunlight and dust, the air trembling with their weight. Some species learn to swim. Yes, swim. Their bones dense enough to sink gently. Their lungs vast enough to hold air like a natural diving bell. They grazed on aquatic plants, leaving rippled trails in the mud beneath ancient lakes. For creatures so tied to the earth they seemed almost designed to defy it. But their serenity could not outlast the shift that followed. When the first humans reached the Americas, they found a land alive with giants, mastodons, glyptodons, sloths, camels, horses. Within a few thousand years, almost all were gone. The sloths were among the last. Some survived on islands, in the Caribbean, on Cuba, Hispaniola, long after their mainland kin had disappeared. There, isolated by sea and time, they shrank to the size of dogs. It is almost unbearably tender, that image. Enormous creatures slowly reduced to smaller versions of themselves, as if trying to fit into a world that no longer had space for them. The last of them likely died only 4,000 years ago, when the pyramids in Egypt were already standing. Think about that. While humans were building monuments to eternity, the final echoes of the Ice Age were fading quietly in a forest far away, unseen, unrecorded. The world turned its gaze toward civilization and forgot the quiet architects of its own soil. The extinction of the ground sloths left more than empty forests. It left a wound in the planet's metabolism. The carbon they stored, the trees they felled, the spaces they opened, all part of a slow ecological rhythm that balanced the cycle of growth and decay. When they vanished, the system faltered. Vegetation grew unchecked in some regions, starving soil of nutrients. Fires spread more easily. Life, once paced by patience, began to rush. But perhaps the most haunting relic of all lies in what we can't measure: their calm. In a world obsessed with motion, they embodied the intelligence of stillness. They moved through time rather than across it. Each step was a negotiation with the earth, not a conquest. They ate, they rested, they shaped, and in their slowness, they gave the world permission to breathe. There's a quiet lesson there, buried beneath the sediment. We often see extinction as violence, but sometimes it is simply the disappearance of rhythm. When the last of the sloths fell, the planet's heartbeat changed again, from slow and steady to fast and nervous. Humanity inherited a world that no longer had patience. The bones we uncover tell us the facts: size, diet, extinction date. But fossils cannot convey the tempo of a life. If you could stand beside one, you would understand why they were sacred to the early peoples of the Americas. Some ancient tribes left carvings of massive, clawed spirits standing upright, arms outstretched like guardians. To them, the sloths were not beasts, but pillars of the world. In their slowness, they embodied eternity. Today, only fragments remain: bones in museums, myths in stone, and trees that still drop fruits no one comes to eat. Yet, in a way, they are still among us. Every forest gap, every shaft of sunlight breaking through leaves, every new sprout emerging from decay. All these are remnants of their design. If you listen carefully to the sound of a rainforest at dawn, beneath the calls of birds and the rustle of leaves, there is another sound, a deep, slow rhythm, almost inaudible. The earth settling, the breath of roots, the silence between raindrops. That, perhaps, is the echo of the ground sloths, the long, patient exhale of a world that once knew how to move slowly enough to last. We imagine evolution as progress, but maybe it is also loss, the shedding of what the earth can no longer hold. The sloths were not defeated, they were released. Their time ended not because they failed, but because the world they belonged to drifted out of reach. In their absence, the land keeps their memory alive, like a story told through wind and soil. And if extinction is memory sealed in matter, then every forest root still whispers their name: Megatherium, Eremotherium, the slow engineers of paradise. Their footprints may be gone, but the path they cleared through time still waits, open and quiet, beneath the leaves. The cold did not belong only to the north. While mammoths and mastodons ruled the tundra, far across the oceans, other worlds of giants unfolded. Different continents, different designs, same silence. Evolution, it seems, was repeating itself in isolation, carving echoes of the same ancient logic into separate lands. In Australia, the sun burned white and the soil cracked like old bone. Yet even there, among eucalypts and red dust, the Ice Age had its giants. Diprotodon optatum, the largest marsupial ever known, moved across the plains like a living boulder, 3 meters long, weighing as much as a small car. It was kin to the wombat and the koala, yet vast beyond imagining, gentle beyond fear. Fossils show their bones clustered near dried riverbeds, as if entire herds had gathered to drink from waters that never returned. They were creatures of drought and endurance, built to survive in landscapes where the earth itself seemed to thirst. Beside them walked Procopodon Goliath, a short-faced kangaroo that stood taller than a man and could grasp branches with dexterous hands. Imagine that. A kangaroo that didn't leap but walked upright, eyes level with the horizon, moving like a solemn sentinel through the bush. And stalking them from the shadows was the thylacoleo, the marsupial lion. Its jaws were compact, filled not with long fangs, but with slicing teeth shaped like blades. A predator born from the same evolutionary script, rewritten by isolation. Its forelimbs were immense, its claws retractable like a cat's. In a continent without placental carnivores, it was a perfect improvisation. These creatures were not echoes of the northern megafauna, but parallel verses in the same poem. Different rhymes, same music. And like their northern kin, they too vanished. Within a few thousand years of humans setting foot on the continent, the giants were gone. The fires we brought, the droughts we worsened, the prey we hunted, all combined into silence. Scientists argue still. Was it us, or the climate, or both? But perhaps that question misses the deeper truth. Extinction is rarely one event. It is a slow unthreading of balance. The Aboriginal Dreamtime stories tell of a creature called bunyip, a shadow beast that lived in waterholes and billabongs, emerging at night to devour the careless. To Western ears, it sounds like myth. But when early European settlers heard those tales, they began to find enormous bones in riverbanks and caves, bones of diprotodons. The bunyip, perhaps, was a memory carried across generations, the echo of a real animal half remembered, half sanctified. Sometimes myths are simply the earth speaking in a language that refuses to die. Across the ocean, another continent followed its own script of enormity. South America, a land of contrasts, where heat and humidity replaced frost and ice. There, armored glyptodons rolled across grasslands like living tanks. Their shells were mosaics of bone plates fused together, their tails ending in clubs heavy enough to break a predator's spine. Some grew as large as small cars. In life, they moved slowly, grazing on low vegetation, their backs shining under the sun like ancient mosaics. When threatened, they turned their tails not in panic, but in calculation, a slow swing that could shatter skulls. Near them lived the macrauchenia, an animal so strange it confounded even Darwin when he found its bones. It had a body like a camel, feet like a horse, and a short trunk for browsing leaves. A creature assembled from memory fragments, as if evolution had been experimenting in dreams. And high above the plains stalked the terror birds, forest wrasses, towering flightless predators with hooked beaks and legs strong enough to crush bone. They hunted like shadows, their steps soundless, their strikes instantaneous. For millions of years, they ruled where cats and bears never came. Every continent, it seems, had its own version of balance. A duet between giant herbivores and the hunters who tested them. Different forms, same principles. Heat turned to mass, fear turned to motion, death turned to renewal. And everywhere, in the blink of a geological eye, the duet ended. The pattern is too neat to ignore. Around the same time, between 10 and 12,000 years ago, the megafauna vanished across the globe. From Australia's marsupials to South America's armored beasts, the story repeats like a refrain. The climate warmed. The glaciers receded. Humans arrived. And the giants, one by one, folded into Earth. Some scientists speak of the Pleistocene overkill. Others prefer the Great Terminal Pulse. But neither phrase captures the intimacy of it. The way the world changed from thunder to whisper. Fossil layers show abrupt endings, bones stacked with no transition. Entire species disappear within a few centimeters of sediment, as if someone turned the page too soon. And yet, traces of their presence remain, not just in the ground, but in the landscape itself. The open grasslands of South America, once grazed by glyptodons, have since overgrown into dense forests. The Australian savannas they cleared turned into scrub and desert. Ecosystems, once sculpted by giants, closed in on themselves. The land, in their absence, began to shrink. To walk those places now is to walk through ghosts. In Argentina, there are caves lined with handprints made by humans who lived alongside those beasts. Small palms stenciled in red ochre, surrounding the outline of what may be a glyptodon shell. The size difference is staggering. The hands of children beside the shadow of a creature that could crush them with a gesture. But the art does not show fear. It shows coexistence. Perhaps even gratitude. Maybe we remember them not just because they were large, but because they were necessary. They gave shape to the world, not through will, but through presence. Every tree, every patch of grass, every pool of water was placed in relation to them. And when they disappeared, something deeper than ecology shifted. The Earth's imagination changed. The islands of isolation produce miracles and tragedies alike. To see those creatures vanish is to understand how fragile the logic of life can be, how the same laws that create grandeur can erase it without warning. Perhaps that's the real mystery of the Ice Age. Not how these giants lived, but why the Earth keeps forgetting its own masterpieces. In the end, the story of the southern giants is not separate from the northern one. It is a single melody, played in different keys. The refrain repeats. Life grows vast to endure hardship, then vanishes when warmth returns. It's as if the planet itself breathes through creation and extinction. Inhale and exhale. Frost and fire. Tonight, as you listen, think of them. The kangaroo that walked upright beneath a burning sky. The sloth that swam through a vanished forest. The armored mammal whose tail swung like thunder. They lived in parallel to the mammoths, the mastodons, the saber-tooths. They dreamed the same dream, and they awoke to the same silence. Perhaps somewhere in the pattern of their disappearance lies a warning, not of death, but of recurrence. Because the Earth has a memory, and sometimes it repeats its lessons until we finally learn to listen. By the time the last echoes of the giants began to fade, a new rhythm had entered the Earth. The sound of footsteps far lighter, but infinitely more deliberate. The first humans. They arrived quietly, without roar or fang, carrying nothing but stone, fire, and the strange faculty of thought. Against the backdrop of mammoths and sloths and armored beasts, they were fragile, unremarkable. And yet, within them, evolution had given the world its most dangerous experiment. Imagination. It began not with conquest, but with curiosity. They followed herds across frozen rivers, learned the language of the wind, the rhythm of migration. For a while, they coexisted with the giants. They walked behind them, scavenged what was left, slept in the hollows of mammoth ribs. To those first wanderers, the great beasts were not prey but gods. Immense, incomprehensible, eternal. They carved them onto cave walls not to boast of power, but to remember awe. But awe, like all emotions, transforms. When hunger met ingenuity, reverence became strategy. At first it was small, a thrown spear, a trap set along a trail. Then, slowly, the balance shifted. A single coordinated hunt could bring down a creature 10 times their size. What they lacked in strength, they replaced with patience. What they lacked in size, they answered with fire. And fire, in its small, flickering defiance, changed everything. Archaeologists still find the remnants of those first confrontations. Burned bones of mastodons, flint spearheads lodged between ribs, mammoth skulls arranged in rings like temples. It wasn't simply about meat. It was ritual, maybe even grief, an acknowledgement that survival demanded reverence for the dead. The hunters sang before the kill, thanked the animal after. In the cold, death was never casual. It was an exchange. We often frame prehistory as brutality, humans versus nature, tooth against stone. But the evidence tells a subtler story. In Ukraine, dwellings made from mammoth bones show architecture as devotion. Walls of curved ivory, roofs woven from hide, fire pits lined with tusks. Inside one, archaeologists found traces of pigment, red ochre smeared across a femur, as if decoration mattered even at the edge of survival. They weren't just sheltering. They were remembering. Some scientists argue that the great extinction of the Ice Age was an act of overreach, the overkill hypothesis, that humans, spreading across continents, hunted faster than the herds could replenish. And perhaps they're right. But numbers alone cannot explain what happened. Because extinction is rarely one thing. It is the sum of small miscalculations. A few too many fires, a few too many kills, a few too many migrations into fragile ecosystems. The giants endured everything but us. Because we were not a storm. We were something quieter, more patient. We changed the world not through violence, but through understanding. There is a strange irony in it. The same intelligence that allowed us to survive would eventually erase the world we depended on. Knowledge became distance. Observation became control. The hunters who once knelt beside mammoth tracks began to see the landscape as resource, not kin. A shift so subtle, it would take millennia to name. Still, the traces of that older reverence remain. In Lascaux, Chauvet, and Altamira, the caves bloom with visions of bison, horses, mammoths, their forms glowing in torchlight as if alive. These paintings were not records, they were resurrections. To paint was to keep the spirit breathing. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with the rhythm of herds, the thunder of hooves. When the artist lifted the torch and stepped back, the figure swayed in the flicker of flame, moving again through time. Perhaps that was humanity's first act of defiance against extinction, to preserve, in pigment and smoke, what the earth was preparing to forget. In that darkness, art was born as remembrance. But what of guilt? Did they know what they were undoing? The bones say little, but the myths whisper otherwise. Across continents, stories survive of giant beings who once shared the world with us. Some benevolent, some wrathful. In the Americas, tribes speak of thunder beasts, mammoths who fled into the clouds. In Northern Europe, ancient tales describe great hairy men who vanished into the snow, leaving only bones behind. In these myths, extinction becomes metamorphosis. The giants did not die. They withdrew. Science calls this cultural memory. But maybe it's something deeper. The earth remembering through us. Perhaps every human myth about lost giants is not fantasy, but confession. The dream of what we've undone and the longing to make it whole again. What made us different was not cruelty, but foresight. We could imagine tomorrow. We could picture the herd before it appeared, the trap before it was built, the future before it arrived. But imagination cuts both ways. To foresee survival is also to foresee loss. And so, even as we thrived, something ancient within us began to ache. An awareness that the world was shrinking around us. One extinction at a time. The last of the mammoths may have fallen to climate, hunger, or disease. But somewhere, in the flicker of a human fire, the final elegy was already being spoken, not in words, but in silence. The silence of knowing. We think of the Ice Age as distant, but its ending is our beginning. Every city, every field, every story we've built since stands upon the graves of the giants. The soil beneath our feet is still thick with their dust, their bones ground fine into the bedrock of our comfort. We inherited the world by accident, and we've been explaining that accident ever since. Sometimes I wonder what they saw when they looked at us. Those first giants meeting the first humans. Did they sense the future coiled within our gaze? Did they understand that the small, shivering figures beside their herds would one day alter the sky itself? Or did they look upon us with the same unblinking calm they gave to the cold? Another inevitability, another season to endure. We will never know. All that remains are bones and echoes, and the quiet guilt of survival. But every now and then, when a glacier recedes and a tusk re-emerges from melting soil, it feels as though the earth is trying to return the conversation to us, to ask, gently, if we've learned how to remember without destroying. Because the truth is, we didn't just outlive the giants, we replaced them. And in doing so, we inherited their burden, to shape, to dominate, to endure. The difference is, they carried their power with humility. We carry ours with noise. Tonight, as you lie beneath the same stars that once watched them fade, try to imagine the moment the world shifted from their silence to our speech. The first human voice rising through the cold, cutting through the sound of wind and breath. That sound has never stopped. But beneath it, if you listen carefully, the deeper pulse remains. The old rhythm, the one that once belonged to the giants, still beating faintly under everything we call progress. There comes a moment in every age when the planet inhales, and the balance turns. The Ice Age did not end with fire or war, but with something quieter and far more complete. Warmth. It crept across the earth like an invisible tide, slow enough to be gentle, fast enough to erase. The glaciers withdrew, leaving behind veins of water that glittered under a new sun. Rivers found old channels again. Seas rose, swallowing the coastlines that had carried the weight of frozen centuries. The air itself changed its chemistry. a subtle shift in breath that no creature could feel, yet every one of them would answer to. For the giants, it was the unraveling of home. Their world had been sculpted by cold, every instinct carved to match the rhythm of frost and thaw. When the rhythm broke, so did their purpose. The grasslands retreated northward. The permafrost softened. The winds turned erratic. What had once been predictable, the cycle of migration, the returning snow, began to dissolve into uncertainty. The mammoths followed the melting ice. The bison drifted to shrinking plains. The mastodons turned toward forests that no longer grew where they remembered. It was not death by violence. It was death by confusion. Even the smallest changes were enormous when seen from the scale of their lives. A few degrees rise in temperature meant rivers changing course, entire continents reshaped. Lakes that had been stable for millennia vanished in decades. The sky brightened. The snow, which had once been constant, began to fall and melt in the same week. In that restlessness, the giants could no longer find their rhythm. Evolution moves slowly. Climate does not wait, and so began the Great Thaw, a moment when the earth remembered its warmth. The meltwater carved new valleys, flooding everything that had been built in the age of cold. Caves collapsed. Ice fields cracked like glass, revealing bodies long buried. And the bones that surfaced were not only ancient, they were recent. The Ice Age had not vanished long ago. It was still dying, even as new forests sprouted in its wake. The scientists called this transition the Holocene, the age of humanity. But in truth, it was the age of absence, the quiet interlude after the roar. For every tree that grew, a giant fell. The world filled with green but emptied of weight. The soil, rich with thawed organic matter, released breath. Carbon exhaled after centuries of stillness. The air thickened, and somewhere in that chemistry, the story of life rewrote itself. When we look at it now through data, ice cores, trapped gases, layers of pollen, it seems mechanical, inevitable. But if you listen beneath the science, there's a feeling of loss, as if the planet itself mourned what it was shedding. Because the warmth was not peace, it was forgetting. Many of the fossils we uncovered today lie at the borders between those two worlds, half in ice, half in mud. You can see the moment of change written into their composition. Oxygen isotopes shifting from cold to warm signatures. Pollen turning from tundra grass to oak and birch. They are records of a planet in transition, of the day the Ice Age took its final breath. But even as the ice melted, it revealed things that should not have been there. Layers of ash in regions far from volcanoes. Sudden die-offs in lakes untouched by human hands. Evidence of something abrupt, something that arrived not with fire from within, but with light from above. Some researchers whisper of a cosmic intrusion, a meteor perhaps, or a burst of solar radiation. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, they call it. Others dismiss it, preferring simpler explanations. Yet the truth feels slippery, hidden in the thin line where science meets silence. Because when you stand in front of a meltwater cliff in Greenland or Siberia, watching ice that has been frozen for 12,000 years dissolve into mist, it's hard not to feel as if the Earth is releasing secrets it never meant us to know. Beneath the layers of snow lie soot and iridium, traces of something that came from beyond. The end of the Ice Age may not have been a gentle thaw after all. It may have been a collision, sky meeting soil, cold meeting fire, memory meeting oblivion. Whatever happened, the result was the same: disappearance. In the space of a few centuries, a heartbeat in geological time, More than half of the planet's large mammals were gone. Mammoths, mastodons, glyptodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, cave bears. A wave of silence spread outward from every continent, until only humans remained to hear it. And what followed was stranger still. The climate stabilized. Too quickly, too perfectly. The Holocene dawned like a held breath released. Temperatures steadied, rains returned. The seasons found their rhythm again. The Earth seemed almost to recover from its fever. But in that recovery was a new equilibrium, one no longer shaped by the giants. The forests that grew were denser, the plains narrower, the skies emptier. The balance was lighter now, quicker, less enduring. We call that progress. But the Earth, if it could speak, might call it amnesia. There's something profoundly fragile about the world that came after. It feels temporary, provisional, a place between storms. The glaciers still remember their boundaries, even as they retreat. The animals that survived, deer, wolves, foxes, are the echoes of larger forms. Humanity rose in the void, but what we inherited was not victory. It was vacancy. Sometimes, in Arctic summer, the permafrost gives up another secret. A tusk, a skull, a footprint preserved in frozen mud. Each discovery is like a whisper from a world that didn't finish dying properly. A reminder that extinction isn't final. It's unfinished business between time and memory. The melt continues even now. The glaciers that witnessed the fall of the mammoths are vanishing again, faster than ever. And once more, the planet warms. We've given the process a new name, climate change. But it's the same story repeating. The rhythm disrupted, the balance undone, the cycle forgetting its own timing. The difference this time is that we are the ones driving it. Perhaps the end of the Ice Age was not an ending at all, but a rehearsal. A lesson in how life answers change, how balance demands humility. But we didn't learn. We inherited a lighter world and filled it with noise, building cities where mammoths slept, paving over bones with steel and glass. The warmth we create now does not come from the sun alone. It comes from fire we refuse to extinguish. And yet, somewhere beneath that fire, the ice still remembers. It holds within it the DNA of everything that once lived. Frozen voices waiting to be thawed. When scientists drill into ancient ice cores, they are not just measuring gases. They are listening to a planet's heartbeat recorded in frost. Each trapped bubble is a syllable of history. Each melt is a translation. If you close your eyes tonight and imagine the thaw, you can almost hear it. The faint crack of ice surrendering. The sigh of rivers being born. The ghosts of giants drifting upward as mist. The end of the Ice Age was not a catastrophe. It was a transformation. One we are still completing. One we still do not understand. Perhaps, in every rise of warmth, the Earth asks the same quiet question. How much memory can a species? Even as the Great Plains emptied and the last herds faded into the fog, the world was not finished with the mammoths. There were still corners of the planet where time ran differently, where the pulse of extinction arrived late. Tiny islands adrift in the Arctic seas, fragments of a colder Earth that refused to forget. Wrangel Island, St. Paul Island, perhaps others still buried under frost. They were sanctuaries carved from isolation, where the mammoths survived while the rest of the world moved on. For thousands of years after the mainland populations vanished, the islands kept their secret. The mammoths that endured there were smaller, barely half the height of their ancestors, their bones lighter, their tusks thinner and more delicate. Scientists call it island dwarfism. But the term feels too clinical for what it really was. Adaptation as longing. The giants, once mighty enough to move glaciers, were learning to live within the boundaries of exile. Imagine that world. An island ringed by frozen seas, the wind unbroken by trees, the night so long the horizon itself seemed to sleep. The mammoths wandered its gravel beaches, drinking from icy streams that ran down from snowfields above. The sound of the ocean was their only company. There were no predators, no humans, no rivals, only silence. And in that silence, they endured. Not in triumph, but in waiting. DNA extracted from their bones tells a melancholy story. As the generations passed, their genomes began to decay, mutations accumulating like cracks in glass. Some were trivial, others fatal. Genes for smell and fertility failed first. The herd grew smaller, the births rarer. The once complex calls that echoed across the plains may have softened into lonely murmurs. Yet still, they lived. For nearly 6,000 years, longer than any empire we've built. They kept the memory of the Ice Age alive. When the last of them died, the pyramids were already rising in Egypt. The Sumerians were inscribing clay tablets. The human story was fully awake. And yet, somewhere in the Arctic dark, a handful of mammoths still breathed, unaware that the world had moved on. Their extinction was not sudden. It was a slow dimming, a quiet fading into the rhythm of waves and wind. No predators came, no hunters, just isolation, genetics, and time. Sometimes survival itself becomes a kind of tragedy. To outlive your own world is to walk inside an echo. On Wrangel Island, the soil is still littered with their footprints, pressed into ground that remains frozen most of the year. In the brief Arctic summer, when moss and sedge bloom, the impressions fill with water, small pools that mirror the sky. The wind crosses them and ripples the reflections, and it looks, for an instant, as if the giants are still moving through the fog. When the first explorers arrived in those regions centuries ago, they heard stories from the Chukchi and Evenki peoples. Tales of shaggy beasts glimpsed through the mist, creatures said to live underground during winter, emerging only when thunder rolled across the tundra. They called them Mammoths, the Earthwalkers. To the locals, these were not myths, but memories. Perhaps they had found tusks melting out of the ice, or bones newly exposed by thaw, and mistook them for the remains of something still alive. Or perhaps, in some deeper sense, they were right. That memory itself is a kind of living thing. Scientists studying Wrangel Island discovered something peculiar in the soil. Layers of pollen, changing year by year, marking the slow warming of the Arctic. As grasses gave way to shrubs and willows, the mammoth's world shrank further. They had no higher ground to escape to. Isolation had protected them from hunters, but not from the creeping warmth that followed. And so, as the seas rose and the ice retreated, the island that once saved them became their final prison. The youngest bones we found there date to around 1650 BCE. Think about that. While humans in Egypt were writing hymns to the gods, while bronze rang through the valleys of China, the last mammoth stood on a stony ridge at the edge of the world, gazing at the sea. Perhaps it watched the horizon, sensing storms that would never pass. Perhaps it lowered its trunk to the water, tasting salt for the first time. Perhaps, as it fell, the waves carried its reflection outward, a final signal from a vanished age. And then there was silence again. The island remained. The bones settled into frost, and the Earth's memory of the giants became complete. But what lingers is not the fact that they died. It's that they lasted so long. Against every mathematical probability, against climate and mutation and isolation, they endured for nearly 6 millennia longer than the rest. In that persistence, there's something more than biology. There's devotion, a refusal to let go of existence. Maybe survival is not about strength at all, but about faith in the continuity of being. When scientists read their genomes, they find errors, letters transposed, genes collapsed, strands repeating nonsense sequences. But between those errors lies something sacred, proof that even at the edge of oblivion, life keeps writing. The mammoth's DNA, though broken, is still a language. It tells of hunger, of adaptation, of the will to continue in a world that no longer fits. Sometimes I imagine the last herd, small and pale beneath the northern light, walking single file along the shore. The sea is rising, the land soft beneath their weight. They pause to drink from a meltwater stream. The calves stay close to the mothers. The wind moves through their fur like memory through time. There are no watchers, no witnesses, only the sky, vast and unblinking, carrying their breath into eternity. Perhaps that's why Wrangel Island still feels different from other places. Even in satellite images, it has a loneliness that hums, a fragment of a dream the Earth refuses to finish. The air there seems heavier, as if the silence itself has gravity. The mammoths may be gone, but their persistence remains in the molecules of the soil, in the slow, unhurried erosion of their world. Every now and then, when the summer sun softens the tundra and the bones surface again, it feels like a message surfacing through time. Not a warning, not a lament, but a whisper. We stayed as long as we could. And maybe that's all any species can ever say. The giants did not rage against extinction. They dissolved into it, one breath at a time, until their absence became the shape of the world itself. Their story didn't end with death. It ended with endurance. And in that, perhaps, lies the quietest kind of immortality. To remain remembered, not because you survived, but because you refused to be entirely forgotten. Long before archaeology named them, before science learned how to translate bones into timelines, the memory of the giants had already found another way to survive, through story. When the last mammoth's breath faded into the Arctic fog, it did not disappear. It drifted into language, into cave walls, into myths that refused to die. In the deep chambers of Chauvet and Lascaux, where flickering torchlight still dances over ochre and charcoal, the ghosts of the Ice Age linger. Horses, bison, lions, woolly rhinos, painted not as trophies, but as invocations. The people who made them lived in the same cold, heard the same wind that once brushed through mammoth fur. They mixed pigments with fat, blew outlines from hollow bones, traced with fingers that trembled not from fear, but reverence. The lines are alive even now. Under the wavering glow of a torch, the painted herds seem to move. The cave walls breathe. Art, for them, was not decoration. It was conversation, a way to speak with what had vanished. When they drew a mammoth, they were not recording an animal. They were calling it back. The act of painting became ritual, resurrection through pigment. In those dark halls, humanity's first memory was born. The attempt to hold on to what the earth was already erasing. Across continents, the same stories appeared, told by people who never met. In the frozen north, Inuit legends spoke of Tuniat, enormous beings who lived before humans, strong enough to lift boulders, gentle until provoked, driven away by change. In Australia, the Dreamtime spoke of the Bunyip and the Diprotodon, spirits of the waterholes, half beast, half memory. In Siberia, the Evenki told of Mamantu, the earthwalkers who lived underground, surfacing when the world grew quiet. These myths are not inventions. They are fossils of remembrance, preserving truth in the only medium time cannot erode. Imagination. Even the ancient Greeks, thousands of years later, would unearth fossil bones near the Mediterranean and think they belonged to fallen giants. To them, the massive skulls with a central nasal cavity were cyclopes, one-eyed titans struck down by gods. In a way, they were right. The bones were the remains of giants, only older than myth could measure. The stories we tell are not lies. They are translations. Each culture, in its own tongue, tried to explain the same absence. The shape left behind when something vast is removed. And perhaps that is what myth really is. Extinction, given voice. We think of prehistory as silence, but it was never silent. It spoke through the hands of those who painted, through the chants around fires, through the naming of constellations that resembled herds and tusks and wings. The ancients did not separate stars from beasts. The sky was another wall to draw upon. Orion was once a hunter of mammoths, the Milky Way the dust of their migrations. Even now, when you look up on a winter night, you are looking at their trails, light from the same stars that once shone upon their backs. As centuries passed, the stories changed shape. The mammoths became dragons, serpents, titans, gods. The ground sloths turned into forest spirits. The glyptodons became armored demons buried in the earth. Every culture renamed them, but none forgot them. Somewhere deep in the collective mind of humanity, the giants continued to walk. When scientists began to rediscover their bones in the 18th and 19th centuries, it wasn't the first discovery. It was the return of a forgotten language. The world gasped not because it found something new, but because it recognized something ancient. The drawings, the myths, the fragments of story, all suddenly made sense. The fossils did not just prove the existence of the giants. They proved the continuity of memory. But what haunts us is not their scale. It's their absence. The further we advance, the louder the silence of their loss becomes. Museums display their bones under sterile light, but the aura of reverence remains. We photograph them, measure them, reconstruct them in simulations. Yet, none of it feels complete. Standing before a mammoth skeleton, we feel something larger than curiosity. We feel nostalgia for a time we never lived. Maybe that nostalgia is an inheritance. Maybe somewhere in our DNA lies the faint memory of watching them move across a horizon. Perhaps our ancestors, those who followed the herds, left more than tools and art behind. Perhaps they left a kind of cellular echo, a memory of awe encoded in blood. And so, our myths continue to evolve. Today, we no longer tell stories of mammoths and saber-toothed cats around firelight. We tell them through screens, through words and images glowing in digital caves. The walls have changed, but the impulse is the same. We draw because we cannot stand the silence. We recreate because we cannot bear forgetting. It's strange to realize that storytelling, the act of remembering aloud, might be the most ancient survival strategy of all. When we speak of them, when we imagine them walking again beneath auroras and frost, we keep them from fading completely. Extinction is never total as long as something remembers. In the far north of Russia, scientists once discovered ivory figurines carved by Ice Age humans, tiny mammoths, their forms smoothed by hands long turned to dust. The carvings were found buried beside the bodies of people, as if the dead wanted to take the giants with them. Perhaps they believed that by carrying their likenesses into the next world, both would endure. Perhaps they were right. Even now, when we carve replicas, build models, and resurrect genomes, we're still performing the same ritual, calling back what was lost. But maybe we misunderstand what resurrection truly means. To bring something back to life is not to recreate its body. It is to remember its meaning. The mammoths, the mastodons, the sloths. They are not gone if we continue to wonder what their absence has taught us. The myths remain because they were never just about beasts. They were about proportion. They reminded us of scale, of what it means to live among things larger than ourselves. In the age of the giants, humility was instinct. In our age, it must be remembered. Perhaps, in the end, myth is the Earth's way of dreaming. Each story we tell of them is another attempt by the planet to recall its own history, to speak through us. And when we listen, when we let those stories settle into our sleep, we are not escaping into fantasy. We are returning to the first memory, the one where everything was still vast and nothing yet belonged to us. So tonight, if the air grows quiet and the stars look colder than usual, remember that somewhere deep in time, the giants are still moving, their shapes still flickering on the cave walls of our imagination. They do not need resurrection. They only need remembrance. And in our telling, they live again, not as fossils, not as data, but as echoes in the long, patient dream of the Earth. For thousands of years, the bones slept, buried under tundra, sealed in ice, held in the quiet patience of permafrost. Then we began to wake them, first with curiosity, then with reverence, and finally, with ambition. In the age of data, extinction no longer felt final. We started to believe we could reverse it. The scientists call it de-extinction, a word that sounds clinical but carries the weight of resurrection. In sterile laboratories under artificial light, they splice DNA fragments recovered from mammoth bones with those of Asian elephants. They map mutations, correct errors, fill gaps with code. Each sequence is a translation of time, an attempt to turn memory back into matter. Petri dishes hum where glaciers once stood. The cold has been replaced by refrigeration, the silence by machines. They say it's not about spectacle, but restoration. The mammoth, they argue, was more than an animal. It was an architect of its ecosystem. Without it, the Arctic lost its rhythm. The grasslands turned to moss. The permafrost thawed. Carbon escaped. Bring the mammoth back, they say. And we might bring balance too. In Siberia, a few dreamers are already trying. Pleistocene Park, they call it. A vast experiment in time. Musk oxen, reindeer, horses, and bison roam where once herds of giants grazed. They trample the snow to expose soil, mimicking the old patterns of migration. And somewhere beneath that cold horizon, the scientists wait for the sound of a new footstep. Heavier, slower, familiar. But behind every promise of revival lies a question we never stop asking. Should we? To resurrect a species is not to fix a past mistake. It is to rewrite history. The mammoth's world no longer exists. Its plans, its predators, its silence. Even if we succeed, what are we bringing it back to? A warmer world, a noisier world, a world that no longer remembers how to make room for giants. We can clone a body, but not a season. We can build a genome, but not a sky. Still, we try, because beneath the science lies something more human. Guilt. We are the only species that remembers enough to regret. To splice DNA is to confess that we wish we had been kinder. It is an apology written in code. And yet, there's a shadow that follows this hope. For every project born of restoration, another is born of control. Genetic engineering doesn't stop with resurrection. it expands into redesign. If we can bring back the mammoth, why not improve it? Make it smaller, hardier, immune to heat. In the name of correction, we become the architects of a new kind of nature, one that obeys us. The line between creation and curation blurs. Perhaps that is the true danger of de-extinction, not failure, but success. To hold power over life so completely that we forget what it means to share the earth with something we cannot command. The giants once reminded us of our scale. To rebuild them as miniatures of our design would be to erase the very lesson their bones were meant to teach. Still, the pull is irresistible. Scientists extract DNA from mammoth hair, sequence genomes in Arctic field tents, store data in silicon colder than the tundra itself. The results appear in journals. The world watches. Investors fund. Stories spread. The idea of the mammoth walking again becomes not science fiction, but a business plan. Somewhere, a marketing team drafts the headline, "We brought back the Ice Age." But maybe the deeper truth is that we never left it. Because the same forces that ended the last one, warmth, speed, change, are gathering again. The ice is melting, the permafrost collapsing, the carbon rising. The past is repeating. Only this time, we are both the architects and the victims. In trying to restore what we lost, we are forced to confront how we lost it. There's a quiet symmetry in that. The mammoth, long dead, becomes a mirror of our future. We study its extinction to avoid our own, but we also rehearse the same errors. Domination disguised as salvation. We think revival will absolve us. But what if the earth does not want its past back? What if memory, once thawed, is not meant to return? Sometimes, when researchers unearth a new carcass, frozen so perfectly it still carries scent, they pause before cutting into it. The air that escapes from those lungs is older than civilization. When they breathe it, they inhale history. One described the moment as sacred, like standing between worlds, one still breathing through the other. Science has no place for reverence, and yet it keeps finding it in the ice, because deep down, every act of study is an act of mourning. We don't dig up the dead to resurrect them. We dig them up to feel less alone. The mammoth, the mastodon, the sloth. Each is a reminder that everything magnificent eventually meets its mirror in time. The question is not whether we can bring them back, but whether we can learn to stop losing what we already have. Still, I can't help but wonder what it would feel like the moment the first resurrected calf opens its eyes. Would it recognize the sound of wind through snow? Or would the hum of machines be the only lullaby it knows? Would it search for a mother whose bones have been dust for 10,000 years? The thought is both miraculous and unbearable. Maybe that is how the earth feels about us. Its most improbable offspring. A resurrection it never asked for. Learning to breathe in a world it keeps remaking too fast. The giants died because they couldn't adapt quickly enough to warmth. We might die because we refuse to slow down. Between those two failures lies a symmetry so perfect it feels deliberate. Perhaps evolution is not a ladder, but a loop. One that brings us back to the same questions, until we finally answer them differently. And maybe that's why we keep reaching into the ice. Not to rewrite the past, but to understand the rhythm of loss. The laboratories, the sequencing machines, the glass vials of DNA. They are our new temples. We kneel before the cold and call it science. But what we seek is forgiveness. Perhaps one day, when the first mammoth returns, the earth will not rejoice. It will simply pause. The wind holding its breath for a moment, remembering what it feels like to move around something larger than us again. And in that brief silence, we might finally understand that resurrection was never about bringing them back. It was about remembering what it means to be small. There is a strange quiet that comes at the end of every great story. Not a silence of absence, but of understanding. The age of the giants did not end with a bang or a flood, but with a whisper so subtle that the world barely noticed. The ice melted, the herds thinned, the predators fell still, and in their place rose a creature small enough to hide beneath their shadows, clever enough to survive their storms, and foolish enough to believe that survival was the same as victory. Us. When you walk through a museum and stand before a mammoth skeleton, the scale overwhelms you. The ribs curve overhead like the beams of an ancient cathedral. The tusks gleam like crescents of frozen moonlight. It feels holy, as if you are standing not before death, but before a truth too vast for words. Yet what lingers after the awe fades is not their power, but their absence. Every bone is an echo of balance, a reminder that the world once functioned without us at its center. The scientists say gigantism was an evolutionary response, a success that became its own undoing. The large live long, but change faster than they can move. The small survive by yielding. The giants could withstand ice, but not time. And yet, in that pattern, there is something eerily familiar. Because now, we are the giants. Our cities are our bones. Our lights are our tusks. We have grown immense in reach, immense in appetite, immense in consequence. But what if the same rule applies? What if size, in any form, physical, technological, civilizational, is always temporary? The mammoth's mass, the sloth's patience, the saber-toothed's precision, all were answers to the demands of their era. Our answer is intellect, innovation, fire that never dies. But the earth keeps asking the same question. How long can anything burn before it consumes itself? The Ice Age giants could not shrink in time to survive the warmth. We, too, struggle to slow our own expansion. Every city we build is a heat source. Every invention another layer of fire over ice. Perhaps our extinction will come not from cold or hunger, but from acceleration, from the inability to stop. And yet, the giants did not resist their ending. They didn't rage against the shifting seasons or curse the thinning snow. They simply walked until there was nowhere left to walk. In that surrender, there was a kind of wisdom, the acceptance that all things, even greatness, must one day dissolve. We, by contrast, fight the idea of endings as if we can outthink gravity itself. But maybe the true intelligence lies in knowing when to let go. I sometimes wonder what the last of them saw before the light left their eyes. The mammoth beneath the aurora, the sloth beneath the collapsing forest, the saber-tooth watching the horizon fade. Did they understand what was happening? Or did they simply rest, trusting that the world would continue without them, as it always had? That is the lesson we keep refusing to learn, that life endures not through control, but through continuity. The bones of the giants tell us that the earth does not forget. Every shift in climate, every extinction, every rebirth leaves its signature in stone and ice. We think we are new, but we are only another verse in the same endless song. The planet breathing in cycles of abundance and absence. The Ice Age giants were one movement in that melody. We are another. Perhaps that's why their story feels so close, so intimate. It's not about them. It's about us reflected in their fate. They remind us that power is never permanent, that survival is not proof of wisdom, and that dominance always carries the seed of erasure. Their disappearance was not punishment. It was correction. the Earth rebalancing itself after an excess of grandeur. When you look at the fossil record, it's tempting to measure their loss in numbers. Species gone, hectares emptied, ecosystems collapsed. But numbers miss what matters most: the texture of their existence, the warmth of fur against wind, the weight of a footstep on snow, the low resonance of a herd moving across the horizon. These are things no equation can hold. They are sensations, not statistics. And perhaps that is where we fail as inheritors. We quantify what should be felt. In a way, the giants have never truly gone. Their shadows remain in our metaphors. Their silhouettes haunt our dreams. Every story of gods and monsters, every tale of leviathans and titans, every myth of fallen worlds is an echo of their presence. We keep telling those stories because somewhere inside, we remember what it felt like to live among beings larger than ourselves. To feel small and safe at the same time. But that safety was illusion. The giants were never guardians. They were reminders, embodiments of nature's patience and its indifference. They didn't protect the earth. They were the earth, moving in visible form. When they disappeared, we lost not just species, but embodiment itself. The world became lighter, yes, but also lonelier. And now, as our own age of warmth unfolds, the same pattern glimmers at the edges of the future. The ice melts once more. Species vanish quietly. Our machines grow louder to drown out the sound. We call it progress, but in the rhythm of it, the same pulse repeats. Expansion, imbalance, collapse. The only question is how many times the earth must exhale before we learn to breathe with it. Perhaps that's why their story feels so peaceful, even in its sadness. The mammoths did not destroy their world. They became part of its memory. Their extinction was absorbed, recycled, transformed into the fertility of the new age. From their bones came soil. From their silence came forests. Even their absence became nourishment. Maybe that is what awaits us too. Not punishment, but return. To dissolve back into the system we've spent so long trying to rise above. The mammals of the Ice Age became the breath of the Holocene. We, in turn, may become the sediment of whatever comes next. And that is not tragedy. It is continuity. If there is meaning in their story, it is this. Life's purpose is not to last forever, but to keep transforming. Each extinction is a translation, not an erasure. The mammoth became the grass that fed the deer, that fed the wolf that walked beside us. The sloth became the soil that anchors forests that give us air. The giants never vanished. They only changed shape. So, perhaps the question is not whether we will survive, but how we will be remembered. Will our remains speak of arrogance or of understanding? Will our bones whisper chaos or peace? The choice, as always, is ours. And the earth is patient enough to wait for our answer. Because in the end, the story of the giants is the story of humility. To be vast and still vanish. To leave no monument but the silence that follows. And in that silence, something eternal hums. A reminder that even the greatest among us must someday return to dust. Not as loss, but as offering. And so the world turns again, carrying the echoes of their weight in its rhythm. The snow falls where their bones once lay. The rivers carve through the plains they shaped. And somewhere in the wind, a faint vibration remains. Not of extinction, but of completion. The giants are gone, but their pulse continues, steady and low, woven into the heart of everything that still breathes. And if you listen closely, in the long quiet between words, you can still hear it. The sound of the earth remembering itself,